start the stream.
Yes, he started the stream.
Yeah, we are live.
I know if recording is in progress, we're probably live. Okay, so good morning, everybody here offline and online as well in the Zoom room. And we also have streams like in the previous two. So this is the third year that we're using live streams as well. While the sessions run, it all started with, a pandemic, of course. The era when time stopped. Last night I told Frank that this was the 6th year that we collaborate with Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in organizing this school, and then I realized that it's been 9 years, and this is the 9th edition of the School for Politics and Critique that we have been organizing this entire time with the support of the foundation. There's always an element of what's so-called theory and a dimension of the event that is dedicated to, no, I wouldn't say activism, I would say action, because sometimes we advocate, proper, some of us advocate proper political action and are critical of the notion of activism itself. Some of them discuss activism, but we discuss both theory and practice. That's the main thing. As always, we bring in new theories or neglected new theories linked to the Marxist tradition. Sometimes leftist eco-socialism, of course it's leftist, it's eco-socialism. So these are the two theoretical dimensions that have been intersecting all of the schools, regardless of whether the general theme has been feminism and the emphasis on xenofeminism or some other thematic overarching issue that kind of assembles the whole thing together at each of the events, regardless of so there's thematic focus in each of the schools, like this year on anti-authoritarianism. We have always taken good care to also bring in theories that are new, as I said, but sometimes neglected. Like we had Silvia Federici a couple of years ago with in a school with emphasis on feminism and Marxism. So we combine those elements, the theoretical parts of the school, with what we intend to be discussion about action. And the idea is to talk about action inspired by what we have learned during the school and the more academic part of it. This year, the final event where we will talk mobilization and political action will be on Monday. It will be moderated by our most prominent activist, not ours just in the sense of his affiliation to the institute, but in the country, Zdravko Savetsky. I put myself there, my name there as a placeholder. I don't have to be in dialogue with him. I will explain why I added myself to the program. We want to discuss leftist socialist mobilization with the feminist focus in it. As you know, primary maybe movement, maybe talk about a whole possible organization, movement, whatever comes out of it that is socialist feminist. That would be the main definition, let's say. So that's why I put myself there, but I don't have to be in dialogue with Zdravko. Some of the participants can, maybe Sonia or anybody else who would sign up for it can maintain that dialogue with Zdravko. What matters is that we also have a feminist there. Okay, Zdravko is a feminist, but also a woman, regardless of whether biological or otherwise. So I'm wrapping up. this was not very ceremonial, but very informative, I think. I'll give the floor now to Frank, who is one of the most interesting Marxists nowadays, according to me. Don't be so modest. We have published his work. We published a translation of his a chapter of a book by his last year in Identities. Maybe he can say more himself with some general introduction as to what strand of Marxist theory he adheres to. Okay, the floor is now.
Okay. Oh, I sit a little bit.
That was for me. Now you have to change.
Oh, if it's okay like this, I can just sit. No, it's okay. No, I'm fine. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I think my interests become clear just by the talk itself. The talk is also quite long because I was supposed to talk a whole hour, so it will be nearly a whole hour, and I think I just gonna start. So the title of my speech is Time, Critique and Revolution. I know this is a quite pretentious title, but the talk actually will about that connection. We live in authoritarian times. Our times are authoritarian not only because a huge part of the population worldwide believes in solutions presented by populist leaders and because presidential systems worldwide became established. The actual authoritarian is ideological, whereby the ideological, like always, has of course a strong practical impact. This ideological is the personification of social relations, so that capitalist relations and capitalist crises are presented as machinations of certain groups or people. The migrant outside, the elite on the top, the criminals at the bottom, the queers, woke and leftists in the middle, and the Jews and some conspiracy behind all that. But our times are also authoritarian because of the use of time itself. There is an authoritarian use in an immediate and direct sense, as this ideology is a classical reactionary invocation of the past, of the phantasma of a good old time, which nowadays have the look of the post-war Fordist way of living, honest industrial mass production, fossil fuel and internal combustion engine, meat and the man as a sole breadwinner of the nuclear family. But this reactionary invocation of the past is also turned in an authoritarian use of the future, as they propagate an enclosure of time and space by all kinds of identitarian politics, by economic and political protectionism, and by techniques of repressive hedging. I would say our present is a derivative of this identitarian and repressive attempt to hedge the future. However, in my talk, I want to address the opposite use of time, an anti-authoritarian and even revolutionary one. It is even more immediate because I want to construct or reconstruct how time itself became revolutionized by the different conceptions of radical critique and of a communist revolution. But I will also try to bring these attempts to revolutionize time into a correlation to the revolutions of time concepts in natural science and physics. There is, so my thesis, a yet undiscovered parallelism and even a silent agreement between the scientific revolutions and the concepts of time and space on the one hand, and the attempts of radical critique to revolutionize our capitalist time and our capitalist age on the other. The first step shall show how time and revolution were conceptualized in classical Marxism, which operated with classical Newtonian time. With classical Marxism, I mean the Marxism of Marx's own time and the Marxism of First and Second International and the socialist labor movement of the 19th and 20th century. However, I want to show that the conception of time and revolution of classical Marxism was already contested by an immanent self-critique, an inner Marxist critique, which introduced a subjective and at once a temporal factor. And the foremost representative and striking of these subjective factors came from the most influential revolutionaries of that time, namely from Luxemburg, Lenin, Gramsci, and Lukács. But it was first, so I will further show, Walter Benjamin, who actually really broke with classical Marxism and its use of classical Newtonian time. He broke by showing that a revolution in time aims for a revolution of time itself. The revolution must be anticipated by a new understanding and a new use of time. This became the introduction of Einsteinian space-time into critique. And finally, there are the weird behavior and the strange effects of time and space in quantum physics, and that corresponds to the current post-structuralist and post-Marxist use of time. So as you see, I want to set two internal histories in parallel here: the history of space and time in physics, and the history of the use of space and time in radical social critique. Okay, so much for the game plan. I start with time in classical Marxism, which corresponds to the Newtonian time and the classical chronological understanding of time. In classical Marxism, the assumption or even the expectation was that the capitalist society will progress quasi by itself towards its own overcoming, namely through its contradiction between labor and capital, whether the overcoming comes through crisis or by a progressive development, and be it on an evolutionary way or by a revolution. However, although this contradiction between labor and capital in a quasi-objective and determinist manner points to its own overcoming, critique in theory as well as in praxis has to identify itself with a standpoint of a revolutionary subject, the working class. So even in classical Marxism, there was no social and historical automatism. There was no necessity, without the necessity to actively take part, and became practical for this necessity. That was so for this necessity that was claimed for our social and historical development. But regardless of this need for a revolutionary engagement in classical Marxism, especially in its concept of historical materialism and its understanding of nature and objectivity, time and space remained the objective and uncircumventable conditions for dealing with the contradictions of society and their historical development. World history has to fight its struggles on this, as it were, natural world stage. And not only is this arena built by a homogeneous time and space, also social practice, and even a revolutionary one, has to act in a chronological, linear, and causal way. Meanwhile, already before Benjamin and his introduction of relativist space-time, a kind of self-critique intervened into what was criticized as a determinism and objectivism in this Marxism. Nevertheless, this critique still tried to hold on to the classical Marxist concept of revolution and its revolutionary subject, yet this self-critique was constructed to downright fix the problem of that classical concept, namely the problem that, contrary to initial expectation, there seemingly was no immanent necessity in the capitalist society that led to revolutionary consciousness and praxis. To solve this problem, the critique was searching for a subjective factor. Although the subjective factor was conceptualized quite differently, there are four striking versions which cover the whole range of possibilities to solve the problem of the classical concept of revolution. These four factors came from the maybe most influential revolutionaries of that time, namely Lenin, Luxemburg, Gramsci, and Lukács. So let's have a look at these four factors, starting with Lenin. Already Lenin pointed out what is probably the main problem in Marxist politics until today. He stated that the proletariat spontaneously produces only trade unionist consciousness that is a reformist consciousness, but not a revolutionary one. Thus, revolutionary progress does not come out with necessity from capitalist contradictions, and it will neither automatically lead to a revolutionary class consciousness nor to a revolutionary organization. On the contrary, according to Lenin, without an external addition, the consciousness of the working class remains trapped in capitalist conditions and in an immediate and reformist economic class interest. The addition that must come from the outside is, of course, the notorious party. For Lenin, the party must fill in for what is absent in capitalist objectivity. The party must stand in for the lack of a progress towards a revolutionary situation and a respective consciousness and praxis. In short, the party must replace the social determinism that classical Marxism expected from social and historical progress and act in the place of this determinism. For this replacement of determinism, Lenin conceived of a party of a new type. A new type means a party that must literally take on the consciousness of the working class, since a party must accelerate and guide it as a vanguard who leads consciousness out of immediacy and beyond its reformist and economist immanence. But that party also must prepare for the pivotal moment of a decisive situation. The party is a means for the political technique of the kairos, so to say. That means for the opportunity to take over economic and political power at the right moment in the right situation. So this was Lenin. The complementary pole to Lenin was marked by Rosa Luxemburg. Luxemburg too criticized the objectivism and historical determinism in the Marxism of her time, and she too saw the necessity to organize and accelerate revolutionary consciousness. But in contrast to Lenin, the subjective factor does not come from the outside in the form of a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries. Luxemburg rather emphasized a revolutionary development that must come from the inside, from inner learning processes, self-organization, and from the spontaneity of the masses. This concentration on self-organization forced her also to deal with the inner contradictions of the political situation at her time. She sought of a way in between faint-hearted social democracy and authoritarian Bolshevism, and she adjusted to a sustained but chronological non-linear development between progress and regression, victory and defeat, social reform and revolution, interruptions and leaps, organization and spontaneism, masses and leadership. Logically situated in between Lenin's vanguard party and Luxemburg's processes of self-organization, it was Antonio Gramsci who introduced into the contradiction of labor and capital and into class struggle the subjective factor in the most proper and true sense. Or better said, he introduced a whole series of factors which all had a particular and forceful subjective dimension or determination. We can condense them all as supplements. To name only the most important or prominent of these supplements: the subalterns and civil society, common sense and education and pedagogy, language and the intellectuals, culture and philosophy of praxis. All supplements can be seen as practices and even techniques to gain civil, cultural, and political hegemony in the course of wars of position and cultural struggles, with all its maneuvers, alliances, tactics, united fronts, etc. All these supplements came from a so far underestimated era, namely from the superstructure, the famous Überbau. While in classical Marxism, the superstructure was derived in a quite mechanical way from an economical and material basis, Gramsci probed the entire superstructure for its use to supplement this basis, in general, and especially the contradiction of labor and capital and of class struggle. This attention for the superstructure became, as we know, a common feature of Western Marxism and critical theory. But there's another another feature that distinguishes Gramsci. A long time before Italian operaism or workerism, he was interested in compositions. And while operaism focused on technical, political, and social compositions, Gramsci addressed a temporal composition, namely a present into which the past extends, but which can also foresee its own future. So much for Gramsci. In Georg Lukács, we find not only a fourth version of the subjective factor, but also a final and conclusive one. It is conclusive as the subjective factor receives an existentialist turn. So what do I mean by existentialist turn? In his famous reification essay from his epical book, History and Class Consciousness, Lukács takes on Lenin's and Luxemburg's critique of social and historical objectivism, but he somersaults their subjective factors, trying to find a kind of immediate identification between objectivism and subjectivity. It is this identification that provides a kind of short circuit to what I call the existentialist. This existentialist seems to be, at first sight, simply the existence of the worker in capitalist society, as his existence, according to Lukács, is alienated and reified. It is alienated and reified by the form of capitalist mediation, namely by the notorious commodity form. However, with this reification and alienation, the actual existential is still not found yet. The crucial point is that in capitalism, not only labor and its results, the objects and the social objectivity produced, become commodified and alienated, but for the first time in history, labor power itself, hence the subject of this production of objectivity, becomes a commodity and gets reified and alienated. And there, according to Lukács, the position of the proletariat differs radically, or better existentially, from the bourgeois' class position and epistemological point of view. While the standpoint of the bourgeoisie reflects on labor, and with labor the essence of society and the practical production of its objectivity, from an external and contemplative standpoint only, taking objectivity just as it is immediately given, the dramatic and existentialist insight for the proletariat, in contrast, is that in capitalism, its own labor power becomes an object and a commodity for use by capital, and with the labor power, its own subjectivity, praxis, and life becomes commodified. Such self-acknowledgement of the labor power is existentialist because it can no longer remain external to labor and social objectivity, as in the case of the bourgeois standpoint, which remains an epistemological and unpractical standpoint, only a philosophical one at best. The standpoint of the proletariat, instead, requires a revolutionary leap, a leap into a practical self-conquest, just as in the leap that characterizes existentialism since Kierkegaard in general. I think this conception of a revolutionary leap was a climax and at once a turning point in the critique after Marx. It was a climax because a revolution is possible at any time. I say at any time because the revolution is now independent of empirical and objective necessary social conditions, as well as of the historical development and ripeness of the situation. Lukács' revolutionary leap jumps, as it were, over all the objective necessary conditions classical Marxism was insisting on, but the revolutionary leap is also relieved from all the different subjective factors which have been added to this objectivity by Lenin, Luxemburg, and Gramsci. So in one word, the revolution becomes possible timeless. The revolution is only a pure logical moment, the decisive act of a self-identification that turns the proletariat into a self-appropriation, and it turns the self-appropriation into the praxis of a self-realization in a new communist society. Lukács has put this whole idea into the formula of the identical subject-object of history. In this formula, not only does the subject identify itself with the objectivity it creates. By this identification, also theory and praxis, necessity and freedom, logic and history fall in one. In other words, with this existentialist formula, Lukács already brought the proletariat straight to a quasi-divine position. And he indeed later attested to himself for that conception a messianic seal. Nevertheless, this messianic fervor was still bound back to Hegelian spirit only, not to the divine or to a god. And so it was left to Benjamin to cross the threshold and to follow through with the divine and the messianic. But before we come to Benjamin and his break with chronological time, let's take a short break and look back at the use of time in classical Marxism and in the subjective factors. The punchline of Benjamin's introduction of relativist space-time, which I want to show in the next step, will be more evident when we follow the temporality of first the objectivism in classical Marxism and then of the subjective factors I just presented. As for classical Marxism, it expected that the economic contradictions must come politically to consciousness by a quasi-automatic progress with an objective inner necessity. And classical Marxism thought that this progress will turn the working class quasi in a causal manner into a revolutionary subject. The subjective factors, in contrast, they all four were reaction to the unsettlement of that determinist expectation. And all four introduced with the subjective factor also a temporal factor, a time factor, which had to step in for what in capitalist contradictions and their historical progress is absent and lacking and contradicts any determinism. Something must come in to fulfill a social progress and a logical and historical necessity that is incomplete, not ripe and never ready without an addition. And the factors can be seen as such an addition. Even more, we can show for each one that they are proper techniques to intervene into social objectivity by calculating with its time and its progress. By the vanguard party, Lenin introduced a hyper-political moment and at once a pure technical lever into chronological time, a lever to accelerate revolutionary consciousness and to be prepared for the right social situation and historical constellation. Luxemburg calculated with the nonlinearity of self-organization and spontaneity. Gramsci introduced various supplements which calculate with different social situations, compositions, and temporalities to shift and transform power relations. And Lukács finally addressed with the identical subject-object a pure logical and as such timeless act of an existentialist leap, a leap that is possible at any time as it is a kind of self-realization of the productive power. However, precisely because the factors have this temporal status, they all could play out only in classical Newtonian concepts of time, in chronological linear time and progress. This was the situation in which Walter Benjamin intervened and executed a break. We can situate this break exactly after Lukács, this after in a chronological but also in a logical sense. Lukács was the last prophet of a revolutionary subject, so to say, as we saw that he announced with the proletariat a downright divine subject, a subject that could create the same social objectivity in which it wants to enter. It is as the proletariat could calculate with society's time and space so that it could literally make history. However, the last prophet is, in the religious order, not the definite and final one with the ultimate message. He only is in the chronological order of time, the one closest to us, and it was Benjamin who retroactively made Lukács this last prophet. Not because Benjamin after Lukács had no more revolution to proclaim, but he broke with this chronological order in or of time itself. This break came, so my thesis, by introducing relativist space-time into critique. This introduction equals the revolution of Newtonian time by Einstein's space-time. And what Benjamin did was a kind of socialization of that space-time that came from Einstein. Socialization does not mean that he has already designed a new communist society of the future. He rather introduced the concept of space-time to find a new understanding of how to revolutionize the existing time and the existing present of the society. In short, we can say that by space-time, he revolutionized the concept of revolution itself. For this paradox or tautology, to revolutionize the concept of revolution, Benjamin sought an exit from two capitalist dimensions of time. He sought an exit from the quantified abstract time in power in the capitalist economy, especially in power by quantifying labor time and the social relation of things, and an exit from the homogeneous continuous historical time, a chronological time which is linear, but not different from the cyclical time of avoid repetition. Yet we can say that this historical time is a function of that abstract social time which is in power in the capitalist economy. I think it was Benjamin's break with classical time that made him such a unique figure in the tradition who posed this question of the revolution. His intervention brought a radical rupture into the traditional understanding of a revolution, and with this rupture, he brought a new understanding of what means tradition itself. This break builds at once a bridge between classical or traditional Marxism on the one hand, and on the other, a post-structuralist or even post-Marxist critique, or in a broader sense, a bridge to postmodern theory. But in a way, Benjamin also fell out of time, as it is unclear what kind of status his critique actually has. He combined philosophy and literature, aesthetics and politics, Marx and religion. And this strange constellation is also why he became such a unique figure and at once everybody's darling. However, as hard it may be to bring Benjamin's widespread, colorful, and opaque oeuvre to the point, the relativist use of space-time is striking and thoroughgoing. We find it in his critique of historicism and social democracy, in his use of pictures and images, in his concepts of past, Jetztzeit, and Geistesgegenwärtigkeit, of the messianic and the divine, of aura, magic, and phantasmagoria, of myth and law, in his idea of archive, remembrance and memory, cult and depth, storytelling and tradition, in his short fragment, Capitalism as Religion, as well as in his long passage work, in his reference to the entanglement between childhood and spatial experience, in his passion for fragments, details, monuments, and ruins, but also in his interest in the technique of photography, recording, translation, and reproducibility. I have no time here to show for all these concepts and texts how Benjamin revolutionized the concept of revolution itself, but I want to sketch out some striking points. In his text on the concept of history, the revolution is neither the outcome of a social progress and the takeover of the economic and political means, as in classical Marxism, nor is a revolution an existentialist leap, as in Lukács. It is only a suspension of time as such. While Lukács led the revolution to the timeless point of an existentialist leap, logically possible at any time, the revolution for Benjamin now is to suspend time. By this, he revolutionizes chronological time negatively, namely by interruption of the continuity of time, by a withdrawal from homogeneous capitalist time, and by a disinvestment from historical time. This suspension of time is supposed to be a political or even revolutionary act of the working class, just like in classical Marxism or in Lukács, namely a kind of general strike. But the proletariat gets its power by, I quote, the secret agreement between past generations and the present one. So the power comes from a past that is incomplete and thereby persists. It is about the return of a history of oppression, which is a self-suppressed, as it were, and it is as if this unredeemed past has a gravitational force that warps and curves space-time, forcing social and emancipatory progress to come back to this unfinished past rather than to move straight forward to complete history. We have here a proper curving of the present by its unredeemed and unpaid past, and this curving, although only a weak messianic power, as he calls it, must invade with downright divine violence to suspend time. Also, class struggle, the Marxian locomotives of history, does not lead any longer to a communist revolution as its final call. Revolution equals only, I quote, the grip of humankind to the emergency hold to stop the train, end of quote. Thus, the suspension of time shall not complete the progress of history by a communist revolution. It shall only interrupt the disastrous self-course of history so that another time may occur, or rather, the time itself may be different. Consequently, in Benjamin's conception, the revolution actualizes the past. This actualization does not mean, like in classical Marxism, that it fulfills the mission of the working class, which developed under capitalist conditions, becomes ripe to finally gain its fully self-presence in a communist future. The past actualized only are the unredeemed victims and the missed opportunities in history, all the kairos, all the possibilities that could have had happened, but are lost in time. Lost in time if we don't come back to them. Like in Lukács, the revolution is timeless and always possible, but not because the moment of self-identification of the proletariat is logically possible at any time. The revolution is timeless possible because it already should have had happened. And thus, it is present not as a lost chance, the present rather is the present because of these missed and lost chances of its own past. This past becomes actualized, but also recognizable in Jetztzeit, here and now time. This motive is maybe the most striking socialization of space-time Benjamin accomplished in the field of radical critique, together with the gravitation of a past that curves society's present. And the Jetztzeit might be the moment in which this curving collapses and the whole past becomes present. It becomes present in one stroke, like in an image. If space-time and its curving by the past is somehow productive for the present, then its products are images. Benjamin reads images as products of imaging procedures, and in these images, society's space-time becomes reified. In images, society's space-time is reified just like social labor is reified in commodities, but without that the social essence could be reflected in the sense of Lukács' conception of reification, where, to bring it once more to the point, in the self-consciousness of the commodity labor power, both social labor time and historical time recognizes themselves and collapses in a divine self-transparency. While in Lukács, the productive power of the working class gains self-awareness in the moment of revolution and leaps into a communist self-realization, in Benjamin, the truth of the past cannot become fully present in an image, but only in its details. With Benjamin, there's not the devil, but the messianic in the detail. To read this messianic means to decipher and actualize the constellation presented in the details of an image, but also to experience the aura or the magic of the image as such, rather than to find a coherent systematic or logic in it. The reading of an image, in which the dialectic is held still, is, in contrast to linear chronological reading of a text, non-linear, and this non-linearity corresponds Benjamin's concern with a non-evolutionary and non-deterministic use of time, progress, and history. Images and pictures present and literally show what relativist space-time is about. Space and time although they seem separable, are entangled. Not only the details, also the fragments play an important role for how society space-time presents itself. For Benjamin, the truth has a time kernel, a Zeitkern, but the truth of this time kernel is rather fragmented. It is a time shard, or as he puts it in his passage work, a crystal who freezes and mirrors, but also contorts the dynamic of past events. Crystallized events, they in fact do give insight into historical constellations, but only like in a hall of mirrors. Despite the fragmented and constellative character, with images, the weak messianic power nevertheless can be brought to the point. This weak power is bound. It is bound in the constellations of the details and fragments, like in monads. The messianic power bound in these monads is nothing less than a historical truth, but the truth can only be released the same way like energy which is bound in the atomic nucleus, namely destructively, only by destroying and shattering. The bound historic truths must be released or even redeemed by shattering the positivism of a historicism who treats historic facts as if they were dead matter. And to set free this power works analog the shattering of the atomic nucleus in physics, which sets free the power or the truth of mass, according to Einstein's famous formula of the transformation of mass into energy, E equals mc squared. Okay, that was Benjamin in his break with classical Newtonian and chronological time. As with every true revolution or event in the strong Badiouian sense, the truth comes afterwards, by the causes and effects a revolution temporalizes. And as Benjamin's use of space-time paradoxically revolutionized the classical understanding of time itself, here all the more the truth must come afterwards, namely by the new use of time that radical critique made. And in fact, this truth presented itself in the new epoch of critique that came after Benjamin, namely by Western Marxism and critical theory. So let's have a look at this new epoch that with Benjamin began. Like we had 4 striking examples for the subjective factors and their temporal status, namely Lenin, Luxemburg, Gramsci, and Lukács. Also for the use of space-time in Western Marxism and critical theory, we can point out now its dimension by striking representatives. And as time has 3 dimensions, we can assign each of the 3 dimensions to one representative and his concept. The dimension of the past we already covered with Benjamin, as we have seen. For the dimension of the future, the best exponent might be Ernst Bloch. Ernst Bloch's use of space-time is complementary to that of Benjamin, as instead of the actualization of an unsettled, unavenged past, an anticipated future should become present. But just like in Benjamin, this anticipated future should become present in order to change this very present. In order to keep communism alive as mankind's daydream, Bloch relied on the materialism of desire, concrete utopia, and the principle of hope. He too thereby relies on the power of an untimely or of an anachronistic in the sense of Jacques Rancière. But in contrast to Benjamin, Bloch reaches ahead and relies not to an unaccomplished past, but to an anticipated future past, an anticipation that is capable of changing the present by a kind of non-simultaneity or non-synchronism. Simultaneity it's called, a simultaneity of the untimely, as he puts it. Oh, strange word. And the position in between Benjamin's invocation of an unredeemed past and Bloch's invocation of a future past is best marked by Theodor W. Adorno. Adorno marked for relativist space-time a kind of endpoint, like Lukács did for the subjective factor. It is an endpoint in the literal, or better in the temporal sense, as Adorno, although influenced by both Benjamin and Bloch, found a position of its own. It is a position in between Benjamin and Bloch, in between past and future, but at once this position is an endpoint because Adorno saw the present blocked and standing still. The present is blocked at the contradictions of the society in late capitalism, as he calls it. Instead of pushing society towards a progress and emancipation, experience a reconciliation that is as imminent as it is forced, leading to a one-dimensional closure, as Marcuse termed it, for man or for mankind. As a result, the present and time in general is not only blocked, they experience a fatal turn and regression. Adorno radicalizes here Benjamin's critique of progress. Adorno was neither concerned with revolutionary development, nor was he concerned with its absence. He was rather concerned with the dialectic of enlightenment, namely that progress in science and technology and in the development of the productive forces turned for society into the opposite, into mass ideology and regression, destruction, resentment, and even extermination. So Adorno too transferred capitalist contradictions and their development into space-time, and he too by this socialized space-time. But with this transition, he was neither, like Lenin, Luxemburg, Lukács, and Gramsci, concerned with the temporal critique of a subjective factor, nor, like Benjamin and Bloch, was he concerned with ways to invoke the past or the future to change the present. He was rather concerned with the dialectic that leads to a closure of the present, and even worse, that turns progress in science and technology for society into the opposite, into individual regression and social destruction. We can even identify where this closure and the fatal turn exactly come from, namely from the technique of identification itself. The closure and the fatal turn shall come through three identifications that Adorno criticizes: by concept thinking, by exchange principle, and by scientific technical reason. It is because of these three identifications and the hidden connection between them that the capitalist contradictions get hermetically closed in a forced reconciliation, and that to the historical progress in economy, science, and technology corresponds no progress in individual and social emancipation. And since through these techniques of identification, society's space-time finds a closure in the immanence of a false totality, as Adorno calls it, he consequently makes an ordered retreat and holds space-time open only by referring to a non-identical. The non-identical stands in as a placeholder for which cannot be completely mastered and accomplished by its identification. Use, value, and nature, hardship and suffering, the preponderance of the object on the one hand and individual autonomy on the other, but also, not at least, a totally different society. Consequently, Adorno's critique marked a kind of zero or dead point. It is a dead point between Benjamin's actualization of the past and Bloch's anticipation of the future. And this dead point is also an end point. Just like Lukács marked an end point for all the subjective and temporal factors, which had been still embedded in classical Newtonian time, Adorno marked an end point for the use of space-time. And tellingly, both Lukács and Adorno marked this endpoint by the techniques of identification, but in a complementary way. While Lukács' identification of subject-object through the self-consciousness of the commodity labor power pointed to a last way out, an existentialist leap out of capitalist contradictions, Adorno saw in identification a closure of social contradiction, and he therefore referred only to what resists its identification. where Lukács speculated with a kind of self-identification of the productive force of society and history, Adorno was criticizing such hypothesis of identification as blocking society's time and space. And while in Lukács' conception, the proletariat, by its self-identification, shall make a reflexive use of its own social essence and potentiality to literally calculate like a god with its own praxis and at once with society's time and space, Adorno saw in the techniques of identification a hybrid of a presumptuous and haughty calculation that turns into doom and fate. Okay, so much for the introduction of relativist space-time into radical critique. We can now come to the current situation, to the current concepts of spine and time in physics, as well as in radical critique. So what would this current situation look like? Well, we had first classical Marxism and its opening by subjective factors that was assigned to classical Newtonian time. We had then the introduction of space-time by exponents of Western Marxism and critical theory. So the next step would be to correlate current post-structuralism and post-Marxism to the paradoxes, effects, and entanglements of quantum physics. Here too, there are exposed authors who can be identified with this renewed incision. Concepts of time and space and radical critique, reminiscent of the paradoxes and strange effects of quantum physics, can be found, to name only the most striking concepts. In Lacan's structural use of Freud's psychoanalysis and of Saussure's linguistic, in Althusser's structural causality and in his aleatory materialism, in Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the rhizomatic, the actualization of the virtual, and the cutting. Maybe we could introduce Katharina's ideas here. In Derrida's temporalization of meaning by the materialism of the scripture, in Badiou's conception of the event and its truth procedures, in Butler's performativity of language, speech, and social acting. All these post-structuralist and post-Marxist conceptions are circling around, just like it is known from quantum physics, around entanglements, paradoxes, uncertainties, and they even operate with a non-representable and an inaccessible and inoperative. An inoperative difference in Derrida, an inoperative other in Levinas, an inoperative community in Jean-Luc Nancy, etc. Especially the classical entities or identities of modernity, the subject and the object, exist only decentered and split, broken, fluent and fuzzy, divided and scattered, multiple and unavailable, perverse, queer, hybrid, etc. Despite the differences, these current critiques have in common to look for concepts adequate to the quandary that the subjects cannot identify and represent neither themselves nor each other nor their objects in a non-precarious way, and we thus cannot calculate and reckon with our very own social relations in a chronological or causal manner. Common in all these conceptions, it's also that they don't lead to a common understanding of time and space any longer. Also, time and space seem to be, just like in quantum physics, fragmented, non-homogeneous, hybrid, etc. And like subject and object, they too have to be deconstructed. So what is new in this current critique is not the non-availability and inaccessibility of our own social relations and our history, since this unavailability has always been the fundamental problem of radical and transformative critique. The new feature is to show that in the last instance, it is time and space themselves that elude, withdraw, and remain unavailable and unreckonable. We cannot define a common understanding of time and space, as time and space themselves negate and resist the homogeneous uniform definition. They are entangled with matter and movement, they are non-homogeneous and fragmented. In short, they just behave weird. This is new in both quantum physics as well as in all the post-structuralist conceptions. So to conclude, we had a three-step as follows. We first had classical Marxism, which operated with a classical Newtonian understanding of space and time. This understanding was opened by the introduction of a subjective and at the same time temporal factor. The second step was the introduction of space-time by Western Marxism and critical theory. And the last step was to correlate current post-structuralism and post-Marxism to the strange and weird paradoxes and effects of time and space in quantum physics. What do we make of all this? What is to be done? We see that space and time are not simply central categories for both social critique as well as for natural science. The real question now, the real task, rather, is to take up their inner relation. The real question now, the inner relation. On both sides, the concepts of space and time have an analog or homolog internal history. And so the question arises to what this analogy refers to. I think they both refer to our capitalist relations, which are both a physical and a social space-time relation, constructing a first and a second nature. My thesis would be that the first external nature and the second purely social nature, that they both overlap in what Marx called an economy of time. We hence had to look how both come together, how the first nature becomes inscribed by a production process and its means in the second nature of our capitalist economy. I think it is because this economy of time is constituted by quantifying both nature, the first and the second nature. This double quantification of the relations of nature as well as of the relation of society is the interface we had to look at. But this would be the topic of another talk or later for discussion. So thank you very much for your long attention.
Thanks so much for the talk, Frank. For those of you, I'm from the other room. For those watching on Zoom or through the live stream, stay on this channel. We're just going to take a quick 10-minute break before we go into the Q&A. So for the people that are here in person, you can get a coffee, get a water, and so on.
Just a quick break. Coffee and cigarette and
All right, if everybody's ready, we can now start the Q&A session. So we'll begin with the people that are physically present. So if anyone's there, Rista can summon you up.
Considering those two factors, how technology is advancing and how capitalism steals any inherent idea of a revolution and turns it into a part of itself, what can we do against it?
I think you already addressed the two main problems. So that capitalism is a self-revolutionizing system in a way, and also overtaking, or even, I would even say it's not just that they overtake revolutionary ideas coming out of the movement or wherever, but also these ideas of the movement in a way are produced by capitalists. So forms or structures or however you call it. And I think also, like you suggested it, that there is no revolutionary subject in the classical sense, but capitalism produces revolutionary subjects not only on the level of movements or classical political subjects, but technology is a kind of revolutionary subject. So we often are forced to think from these revolutions, which happens inside capitalism. And so in a way, we are also overtaking these revolutions to produce our revolutionary ideas. So classical Marxism was thought its own revolutionary praxis from rather industrial forms. Now we have post-Fordism, or I don't know, digital age, and so revolutionary ideas often picking up on this idea of now that everything is connected and we have a network, maybe a communist society should base on these kind of means of production and these kind of productivity. But I don't know how to revolutionize capitalism if the quandary is that capital is revolutionizing itself constantly. But that remains internal revolution. Already Marx was speaking about it. Capitalism cannot must revolutionize itself, at least on the level of means of production and ways of producing.
Okay, yeah, house rules, because I was a bit confused about moderation of the questions, right?
I can.
Because we have Zoom room and we have real life room. It's best if you take the questions directly, and in the Zoom room, Zach will take the questions.
Okay.
So we always go one question from here and one question from the Zoom. So let's ask Zach if there is a question there.
Okay, yeah, so if there's anyone in the Zoom room that has any questions, you can raise your hand either physically or through Zoom and ask a question. Okay, I don't think there's any questions from Zoom for now, so we can return to in person.
Okay. So anybody else? No.
One comment and one question. My comment is about the expression Western Marxism, which is quite often used, and it is how we perceive Marxism. Because Marxism is by definition Western, so Karl Marx and so on, they lived in Germany, England, in what is perceived as the West. So the Marxism got Easternized. So we can talk about Marxism and Eastern. Where Western is progressive and Eastern is not so much. So that was my comment. My question was something similar connected with Isidora, what has mentioned. You have mentioned in the context of Lukács that revolution is possible in any time, meaning today also. My question is why we don't see it, or a lot of people, a lot of workers don't see it in the context when the material preconditions for socialism and communism are here, or at least they are much in better position than in Marx time and in Lenin's time. So what is the reason why we don't see it, even though our societies are rich or richer than 100 or 150 years ago?
Term, but when it was introduced by Perry Anderson, he meant it as a critique also of Western Marxism. And Western does not mean Western progressive and Eastern regressive or non-Marxist. It was not so much a geographical division, but it was just Marxism opposed to official Soviet Union Marxism. And there's a lot of figures who were so Western Marxist, but were like Lukács also active in Hungary or in Eastern regions, also like philosophy of praxis in Yugoslavia. So I think it's not so much a geographical division, also, although it was directed against the Soviet Marxism as a time, but it is rather so definition what is so critical or unorthodox Marxism and orthodox Marxism. I know it's a problematic term. I only use it because everybody understands what it meant. But it's long forgotten that Perry Anderson was not a big fan of Western Marxism. He was criticizing Western Marxism because, not harshly criticizing, but if I remember correctly, was criticizing Western Marxism being too academic and losing totally all relation to praxis. Domenico Losurdo has recently written a book where he even radicalizes this kind of critique. About Lukács and the revolutionary situation at his time, he himself immediately took it back. As you might know, he wrote a lot of self-critics, and he said, okay, this in history and class consciousness, and especially in this reification essay, it was a whole idealist construction. Of course, for really to have a revolutionary situation, we need all these Leninists, so preparation, a party, a good organization. So I think even Lukács himself, and especially when in Germany there was the demand for reproducing the book, it was rather hostile to reproducing it and said, okay, you can reproduce it, but only when I can write a new preface. And in this preface, he said, that was a stupid idea. So he himself already said, so there might be a problem with this logical idea but I think what I think is so in a way timeless is this idea that in a way something like so as Badiou would say, the pure axiomatic idea of a communist society or a communist revolution must be when the productive forces or the productive power of the society can make a reflexive use of themselves. And this is why I was using it, because I think this is so, in a way, it is an endpoint of what is the most condensed, most striking idea of a revolutionary situation, and at once a revolutionizing capitalism, when the productive power and the enormous increase of productivity we experience in capitalism has a way to make a reflexive use of its own capacity or potentiality. And in former times, of course, so the productive forces were identified with even the body of the worker or the mass worker. And then, as we know, then, so the concentrated mass worker of the fabric in the end of the 70s, already with operaism, as you know, operaism, Margaret Tonti was still thinking, okay, this is a strategic position, even if the mass worker in the fabric is only, I don't know, 15% of the Italian population, but this is a decisive, so like for Lenin, the decisive position of Russia was in the chain of the capitalist imperialist country. This was the weakest chain in the whole chain of the international situation. And for workerism and operaism, and especially for Tonti, the mass worker and the fabric was the strongest chain in the assembly line of the production process. But when the mass worker of the fabric became decentered, now then these ideas came up, okay, it's not the Fordist mass worker, but it's a social mass worker, or it's the multitude, or it's we all. And I think in a way, we still hinge to the idea that so a different society cannot come without these dealing with this productive power and the productive forces we have in capitalism. Maybe not in the classical Marxist idea that so the proletariat or the working class is taking possession of itself. Maybe it's a more radical idea coming from critical theory, Western Marxism, that we rather have to get rid of so this form of working, and the class subject has to negate themselves rather than to fulfill themselves. But in a way, I think we still have to deal with this enormous productive power we have in capitalism, which is not any longer embodied in a classical political subject, but in, I don't know, you can term it multitude, or you can term it precariat, or you can also term it surplus population. Maybe Clover will talk about this quandary, that so this is maybe the major problem, that capitalism is getting rid of this so classical productive forces, and so maybe communism must come out of this quandary, that so it's enormous productive, but no need of so masses of population, as you were also addressing it. I don't know if we make these online.
Yeah. So again, if there's anyone in the Zoom room that has a question, if you don't have one in the Zoom room right now, just raise your hand, and after this question in person, we can get to.
I think he was first, and then.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or something from today.
Yeah. The problem is these three alternatives, which look rather just taking over some capitalist form of organization. There's either the Stalinist so state accumulation, which was so, in my view, it was just a primitive accumulation in so conditions and the special conditions of Russia, and was of course has nothing to do with the alternative and all the cruelty of the primitive original accumulation we had in 200 or 300 years in the classical capitalist countries with all the slavery system, colony system, imperialism. Russia had to make in 20 or 30 years. And then so the opposite pole is so this idea of a market socialism. So we should use so these invisible hand, this enormous rationality of the market, but so in a way hedge it and so make it so socialist. And there's this thing in between, these so Soviet idea, Räte idea, or this so self-organization of the workers, like in Yugoslavia or in the, I don't know, in the early operaist idea. So the Pansieri was also in favor of this idea of some collective self-organization centered still so on the rooms or the spaces of production, like fabric or communities, maybe cities or whatever. But I think so, in a way, it has to be something totally we can't even imagine. I think so. It remains always in a way a capitalist to just take something out and say, so we just have to add socialist in front instead of capitalist. So socialist science instead of capitalist science, socialist law instead of capitalist, no, socialist state instead of capitalist state, socialist market instead of capitalist market. I'm totally blank. I have no idea how to get out or how an economy would look like. If it's even an economy, maybe. So having an economy in the narrow and the strong sense is something specific capitalist. So before capitalism, there was, in my view, there was not even economy in the strong sense. It was always entangled with social life, with religious life, with cultural life. So maybe we also have to ask, so what could a society look like which has not an economy in this classical sense, going to work, producing, buying the things I or other had produced, using money, quantifying, so social relations, work relations, labor relations, power relations. I think.
Yeah, but I think what's easier for the camera.
Only 1 second.
Okay, so, well, I actually had 2 questions, but I'll try to be brief. Once I'm looking through my notes when you were speaking about Lenin and his idea of how socialism works, I was reminded of a book I read by Richard Pipes on the 3 whys of the Russian Revolution, and the historian himself used to be a counterman to President Reagan. So in a way, he is on the opposite end of the spectrum compared to Lenin. And then what I found interesting is that he also criticized this tendency towards historical determinism and the fact that the revolution itself was supposed to happen or that it was going to happen anyway. My question in terms of that, and to connect it to authoritarianism, is, isn't this idea about historical determinism, which also makes the vanguard of the party determined in itself, authoritarian in a sense? So to tie it back to the original premise of the school, in that sense, does this deterministic interpretation of history, especially coupled with Lenin's view, contribute towards the sense of authoritarianism? I'm also really interested in constitutional design. So in the introduction, when you mentioned the presidential systems as a way of contribution towards authoritarianism, I really appreciated that. And my second question would be these conceptions of time. So what do we need to change in our conceptions of time to contribute towards the fight against authoritarianism?
Oh, idea how to. I don't have no idea of a revolution of a different society, how to overcome the actual situation where all these presidential systems are the role model for all populist leaders. So worldwide, it's a problem in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, South America, North America, obviously. I have no idea what to do. I think it would be a help if the Social Democratic Party would still, or the Social Democratic forces at least would still be social democratic, so that we have at least some pole opposed to this. But if you look, so there's coming soon elections in Italy, and the PD it's quite ridiculous. They are not able to. It was a little bit of a situation like when we had the high peak of neoliberalism, when the Social Democratic Party said, "Ah, shit, we also have to do this." When neoliberalism was already over, then the Social Democrats think, "So now we have to do it neoliberalism." And a little bit, so I think that the Social Democratic parties, like in Denmark or in Scandinavia, think, we also have to do so harsh anti-migrant politics. We also have to provide provide some, I don't know, nationalist anti-migration laws, ideas, etc. But so what I found striking in Lenin is that the prejudice is Lenin was a strong fan of historical determinism and objectivism. And I introduced him as the first one in my chronological or logical order, and the first one who introduced a strong subjective factor criticizing historical determinism. And I think so it's a little bit forgotten that although Lenin stands for this tradition of social necessity, and the party must only fulfill what is already so embedded in the historical progress or in the social contradictions. This is, in a way, it is true, but on the other hand, it was also a very technical use of this determinism, and technical use which was said that there's something like something missing in the objectivity and in the determinism. So I think it's Lenin and the whole situation in Russia is an interesting constellation. I think it became even interesting constellation for now right-wing populists, that they also look, so how is a constellation and what is lacking in the constellation, and how can a political act or a political organization or a party, although only a minority, introduce themselves in this constellation and take over political and economic power. And I think this is a little bit the name Lenin stands for this entanglement between objectivity and historical and social determinism, and what is absent and lacking, and what do we need, what can we introduce in this open space. And in his time, it was so a vanguard party of revolutionaries. And I don't know if we can still use these ideas. So there's Andreas Malm, who says so in front of the Anthropocene and the ecological crisis, we need some kind of Leninism or a Leninist moment, but this time not to establish an industrialization in an underdeveloped country, but this time to dismantle industrialized countries and come to a transformative process. We have no time, we can't wait before, I don't know, social democratic social movements are ready or can take over power. We need a Leninist state of emergency, so to say, to not to make a revolution, not to make an industrial revolution or industrial development, but at least for stopping these kind of ongoing ecological crisis. So these two things I know of how the political right and leftists are trying to make use of this Leninist idea of a strong vanguard party who intervenes in a complicated constellation and situation.
Filling in the gap.
Yeah, filling in the gap with precisely this. While Luxemburg said so, there is a gap, there is a lack of consciousness, there is a problem of that we need a strong praxis and organization. But she was rather referring to self-organization. So she was in favor of a party, of course, too, and also maybe a party of in the Leninist style, but she was also introducing the other moments, so basic organization, self-organization, learning processes, learning from defeats, and so this is why I said so. It's a complementary pole. So both were party politicians, but so different kind of a subjective factor.
Okay, so I'll give a final chance to those. Oh, there's a question there.
Alternative in terms of self-organizing and various ranging of living politically outside of the state system or invisible. I would agree. Maybe I would like to hear from you. What do you think about the alternative of small self-organized economic subjects who would resist current state, at least in our country, where we cannot think about alternatives at all. We have to go the stream, what the state determined as the right way to deal with the economic crisis, or because I think that I think that the idea of a small self-organized economic subjects, more of them, would be an alternative of this continuous piling up profit thinking or formalized economic activities, and that you cannot exist in the society unless you're on the system of social system or in the employment agency, or I don't know where. You have to be somewhere. Otherwise, you cannot function. So this is what we are pushing for, at least on a local level, as an alternative to what is going on.
I was always organized in the autonomous movement of the 80s, and I was always interested in this kind of self-organization. But as we all know in experience, they either remain niches, so niches in the society or niches in the history, because there were also broader experiences, but so for a short time, like in Spain or in Russia. But so the bigger problem, or I don't know if it's even a problem, they do provide an alternative, but an alternative which is so part of the self-revolutionizing of capitalism. It's often not only that they show new forms of how to work, so so they are not only economic niches, but also all these sexuality experience, all these free spaces, leftist and emancipatory, so basic, so organizations or movements or experiences introduced often became so mainstream, and so then in fact there are alternatives, but alternatives also for capitalism to show we can have different kinds of sexuality. People can have tattoos. We can produce by non-top down, but by self-organizing. I think this is in a way, this is maybe it's a little bit the job of ourselves to provide alternatives, although we know they are also helping to reform capitalism or taking over and become a monster we didn't expect, like neoliberalism in a way came out of the 68 movement. So without blaming the 68 movement, but we know this dialectic of
But I was not talking about communes or that type of self-organizing. I'm talking about self-organizing specifically activities that are never there as an opportunity for certain groups. So these ways of small self-organized, for example, women that are not business oriented, that are not skilled in new technologies, that are not, just they put cracks. Yeah, they put cracks in the current system. In my opinion, might put cracks if starting to happen. Not talking about big movements that are, will turn around the world. It's not possible.
But I think also for this, so often they are coming out of just of necessity, because they live in horrible situations. They are forced to self-organize, and the more it works, often the more it becomes then just an economic, cooperative, or I don't know. I don't know if we can really. So it would be a too big demand for them to also say, now you have to crack the system or build a really alternative. Of course, so I would be very happy if it would be the outcome, but I can't expect from them to so often under hard conditions have to self-organize to say, so all my hopes go in there like it was. I remember the Zapatistas, because again, maybe bigger experience, but I know there was big hope. So from a lot of people that this might be a model for, I don't know, for general, basic self-organization, not only there in this region.
Zach, do we have someone on Zoom?
There's still nobody has raised their hand here, so.
Okay. Just a second.
Are there more questions from the room? I can't see, so.
Okay.
So I have two questions, some of the hypothetical. First, in regard to the technological development, do you think that now we have somewhat a history repeating effect like we had in the ballot book? Because in that again the same thing is happening, and which is actually the subject of this conference, that leftist ideologies are becoming somewhat authoritarian. I think due to the combat between the various options. Let me just in a ballot book there was a struggle, for example, between Rosa Luxemburg and Bernstein, and then he became social democrat, and then his ideology became was used by the Nazis. And today we have a pretty similar situation, and I think the reason for this is this cultural divide between East and the West, and those forces which are with the East, I think, are more that are more have more tendency towards authoritarianism. And actually, if you know, the Nazi Party wouldn't have won if in the first circle didn't have help from the communists. And for example, here in North Macedonia, Levica, for example, is also which is extreme left, is also with the Russian and is also with the far right, collaborated with the nationalist ideas, you know. And so, do you think what shall we do to stop this? If possible, maybe I think technology can help, because now we have Zoom, and then you know Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg, they were publishing in the same magazine, and there wasn't enough space, so maybe they how this problem arose. And the second is just like again a hypothetical question. What happens with the Georgi Dimitrov monument in Berlin, and how important is
Which monument?
Georgi Dimitrov, the one that said no in the right side. And by the way, I want to say also that our cameraman looks actually exactly like Georgi Dimitrov.
So there is no problem between Macedonians and Bulgarians. Everything is now.
I was wondering to whom that she looks like, and
I can't say about the monument of I didn't even know that there still is a monument.
No, that because when
the wall fell down, they dismantled all the. They dismantled not only a lot of monuments, but also renamed a lot of streets. So a Marx Street or Luxembourg Street or Luxembourg Platz might be okay, but all the Dimitrov streets, they were all replaced by, so I don't know, neutral names. So there's, as far as I know, there's no Dimitrov statue or monument in the eastern part of, so of course not in the western part, but also in the eastern part, which was where everything was renamed and dismantled. I can't remember the next one.
Only Ernst Thälmann is left.
Ernst Thälmann is left. So, and there's a big discussion because the conservatives and the liberals always ask to dismantle it, but it's under protection by Denkmalschutz. I don't know the English term, so it's not possible to easy, in a way, cultural heritage, as far as I know. I organized a talk 3-4 years ago, but I can't remember what exactly the situation is. But it's not that easy. So the things still remaining are often not easy to dismantle. The same goes for, we have a very, very big monument in the Treptower Park. I had the Treptower Park, the monument.
I mean, it's a huge monument.
It's a huge, very Stalinist monument. So with a big soldier with a sword cutting swastika into 2 pieces, and a lot of
smaller monuments besides, which are really pure Stalinist, but they can't dismantle it because it was still in the context. And so these things have to remain in heritage. So
I think what a shift for the European Union, because the Constitution says it is all about values, not about interests, and they never had an initiative to make a monument. And I think still he's a very big hero.
You mean Dimitrov?
Yeah.
Yeah, but the first question was very, very interesting because, of course, there are a lot of similarities with the situation in the 20s. And I think especially there's a similarity between the industrial revolution at that time, so electrification, radio, television, and the industrial or the post-industrial revolution we experience today with digitization. But I think this is exactly also how in a way, the same situation repeats itself, but in a totally different or opposite context. Because in the 20s, it was in the time of class struggle, and obviously we are beyond a post-class struggle situation. In the 20s, the new means and the new technologies were used for a formalization and forming of the masses. And nowadays we have self-activation and the self-mobilization, which is so very down level and reaches or gives the possibility to 20 or 25% we always had in the population, but we're not really able to self-organize. So all this right-wing populism and all this activism we have in the internet has to do with this easy access for this part of the population to get engaged and to get activated, and then also to mobilize and maybe even create some kind of organization or parties. So I think this is so, and also these 20s were still in a situation of classical imperialism, and now we live in, I don't know, post-colonial times. China, India, Brazil are rising up countries. So I think it's worth to do both, to look at the similarities and to also look why today we have in a way the opposite situation of what the 20s or the end of the 20s have been.
You think that then collaboration to the extreme right or now? Now, because now the extreme left is collaborating to the extreme right. But like this, you don't think so.
Okay, yeah.
First in the Zoom. I can talk in during the break.
My question is about the definition of the revolution. So how should we grasp the definition of revolution, and is there a need to redefine it by having in mind that the world is financialized and moved its industry in the Asian countries because of the cheap labor? So any revolution in a state level would not affect the macro levels because we are too globalized and related. So the worst scenario would be to stop the flow of capital in that particular place, which it will end in an economic disaster. So how should we grasp the definition of revolution, and is there a need to redefine it?
I think there's a need to redefine it, but in a way, there was never a true or final definition what a revolution looked like. And I think one fraction was exactly that. So is it possible to make a national revolution, a socialism in one country, or is it Trotsky's position true that the revolution always has to be a permanent revolution and has to be a worldwide revolution? And I think so. Why we still have Leninists, but we also still have Trotskyists and we have Maoists in these classical and kind of old school and maybe in a way outdated ideas of revolution, is because exactly of this experience. So Leninists still thinks it's possible to have at least something like a socialism in one country. Can be old school Leninists, or can be also just modern forms of Leninism. Then there's these Trotskyists who are always pushing and saying, no, the revolution has to be ongoing, be it inside a country, but even more on a global level. So we have to look for a worldwide revolution unless we will have Stalinism again. And there's these Maoists insisting on then we need a kind of second revolution. So only economic and political revolution is not enough. It has to be also some kind of cultural revolution. It has to also address the masses, not only the working class, but also the peasants, etc. I think this is those classical role models of revolution. But I think, of course, we have to redefine what a revolution could look like. And there's also a lot of attempts like Badiou, is reformulating it in terms of the event and truth procedure, Negri and others speaking of multitude and constitutive power. And I don't know, there's a bunch of theories which all try to still hold on the idea of revolution, but try to, I don't know, adjust it to the actual situation, or coming out of these old school, schematism like we have in Lenin, Mao, Trotsky's forms of revolution. I myself, I'm again blank. I don't know. I can only address a problem and
the Leninist idea to end again, I would say, hardcore nationalism, especially with Stalin. And take the example of Albania, for example, for 40 years, they invested only in nationalism. They didn't try to change the.
So the one lesson, especially in Germany, was that nationalism was a disaster. Nationalism, this is why the German radical left become quite anti-national, because when there was in the beginning of the 90s a big looking back what went wrong, it was really addressing these problems that this combination between socialism and nationalism was not a good idea. So maybe it was a social necessity under certain historical circumstances, but this nationalism is not, you can't overtake it with the leftist idea. Okay? We can't let the nation, we don't have to give the nation to the right-wing populists, we have to use the nation, but for good. So I think we always have to be internationalists and against, at least our own nation, which is the duty of everyone. There's a lot to do before criticizing other nations. And the perspective has to be global. I agree. It's not only because nowadays we are globalized. It was right from the beginning global. Capital was right from the beginning global, and the nations have been a reaction to this global character of capitalism. All these colonies, imperialism, it's already a reaction of the even universal character of capitalism. It's not like classical Marxists who said, there's different stages, and we have to have first the nation organizing of the industry, and then we can look at a bigger level. It was right from the beginning globalized, and nations were attempts to hedge this global situation of capitalism.
No, because we can. No, because we're.
Yeah. Nothing in the Zoom.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to comment, maybe add something to the general discussion. I was reminded of this scene in the movie Usual Suspects, where as a the biggest trick of the devil was to convince everybody he didn't exist. So we keep talking about neoliberalism with the preconceptions about neoliberalism that were given to us. We inherited them through the mainstream, media mainstream, academia mainstream, without actually examining and questioning them, and actually buying the story that neoliberalism globally functions thanks to the weak state. It's proven by David Harvey and others. Can't remember the other names. Harvey is the most famous, so it comes to mind first. There is this guy Igor, I cannot pronounce the last name. Turkian Brot, I don't know, some Scandinavian name, and others who have okay, I will remember the name. Several. The problem is these are a handful of scholars that argue the following: that actually global capitalism, or its neoliberal form, can be sustained only through authoritarian rule. Authoritarian states and authoritarian states in mutual or or orchestrated, let's say, through a mutual alignment, let's say, organized authoritarian rule on global scale. So kind of aligned along these lines of, exacting strong state. His argument, you can find it also in his interview for Webster Books in 2015 or 16. There is also an interview where he explains this briefly. But there is a whole book that elaborates on this. And as I said, that there are other authors. I will remember the names during the break and tell them to you. So what they prove, Harvey and this couple of other authors, was strong state continues to sustain global capitalism as of the beginning of the 2000s, in particular after the bubble in 2008. On the other hand, we are supposed to live in a post-ideological, post-political global era. So we have culture as the predominant category when we think of political or power relations. We have to think about them through culture and through, gender identity, etc. That all falls under the category of culture. Or as the prophet of neoliberalism and the extreme center, Anthony Giddens said, it's all about lifestyles, culture and lifestyle. So we're supposed to be post-political. We're supposed to believe the neoliberal consensus that we're living, that neoliberalism exists thanks to weak state. Therefore, we cannot criticize the state, the states as we have them nowadays. Therefore, the left is robbed actually of the opportunity to criticize authoritarian states that in fact sustain global capitalism in its neoliberal form as we know it. So in a way, by a certain hijacking of the discourse, basically, those who rule the planet robbed us of language to criticize whatever is wrong with what's going on with this planet and with the global economy as it is. So they also, I'm coming to the point which actually inspired me to comment Mara's experience. Yeah. So in the same sense that as global capitalist order or those running hijack so much of our linguistic opportunities to criticize it, they also kind of engulfed and fetishized certain models that we could have used as resistance, as an alternative. I remember Takahisa Oishit's, a Japanese Marxist, kind of excavation of excerpts in Marxist writings, where Marx insists that these associations of free workers could create little islands of resistance and alternative that could, or you should say, grow into a paradigm shift, a change of the paradigm, if this flourishes. But what happened with the neoliberal culture, political culture, let's call it, it also hijacked this possibility, but by advocating entrepreneurship. So now, even this is taken away from us because this is what they talk about. So it cannot be our form of resistance. It's very interesting how Gramscian, this neoliberal consensus, has been acting all these decades and has been robbing us of discursive possibility to think of an alternative. That's kind of a comment.
Can I comment on the comment?
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think, of course, neoliberalism is not about dismantling the state, but over the state and using it. But I think it's interesting that we have a neoliberalism 3 different stage, which we lived in the last 10 years. We had first these 90 beginning 2000s classical neoliberalism. Then we had the crisis, and then we had the technical form of neoliberalism in Greece and Italy, etc. Then we had these authoritarian forms of neoliberalism. Still, done by these classical exponents, parties, governments, etc. And now we have even the fascist form of neoliberalism. But the quandary is that neoliberalism has always this dark side, has always its other. Lazarato has shown it for Chile and the coup d'etat in Chile done by the neoliberals. But the interesting thing is, it looks like as if the neoliberals got under attack by some foreign enemy, and it's in its own others. Because of course, Trump is part of the neoliberal elite, but he's faking as if he's the one criticizing globalists, neoliberalism, etc. And the left is now forced to help neoliberalism out of this own enemy or this own dark side. And this is still, I think this is also again a little bit the situation in the 20s, that the bourgeois class cannot explain its own dark side or its own riddle. Why liberal democracy turned into its own other? Why out of the Weimar Republic comes out National Socialism? And it looks like the left now has to defend civil standards. Since, I don't know, in Germany, since 6 or 7 years, we have to always defend Angela Merkel for their migrant politics. We have to defend COVID politics against their crazy enemies. We have now defend the öffentlich-rechtliche broadcasting system like the BBC in England against alternative media and the attacks from right-wing populists, although we should be the one criticizing Angela Merkel and COVID politics and the öffentlich-rechtliche Rundfunk, so the official broadcast companies. But they are so hard under attack from their own dark side that it looks like logically everybody knows so fascism, authoritarian forms are part of neoliberal since the beginning, of liberalism since the beginning. But it looks like it's two different political camps, and the leftists now have to decide on which side we are on. Although our job is to addressing exactly this flip, these flipping or this turning over. Yeah.
Outside of this one.
Yeah, but I think so our job is this is why I'm also a fan of critical theory, because they were always saying this is one of the main problems of modernity. So even out of some progressive classes, ideas, be it of political liberalism, be it of economic productivity, be it of scientific progress, the same progress turns into its own opposite. It's not because of an enemy outside, but it's because the same progress has this flip side and nobody knows how to stop it. And it's not even so on a logical level you can address it, but on the political empirical level, it looks like it's two different camps, and we have to decide, are we on the liberal or neoliberal camp in these hard times, in times of crisis, or we are on the right-wing camp, and we are not able to say, in a way, they look like enemies, but they are brothers in arms. Yeah, or turning one.
If you don't mind, with the neoliberalism and the capitalism together, we just have to add that there is not post-colonial period, it's still colonial period. Because now the black humor jokes after the death of Queen Elizabeth, people are saying in Greece, for example, the Brits are in chaos. Let's go to the British Museum if they take the Greeks of the Greek markets. And this is still colonial period. This is not post-colonial, because also in the academia, there's still the projects and research agenda when they're talking about global south, because it's very visible that we are separated by the equator. It's the rich north and the poor south. So when they're saying post-colonial era, it's not called post-colonial era because the colonialism never ended.
Yeah, but I think the term post is okay because it says in a way it's still colonialism, but we also have a different situation. It's not the same as it was in the turn of the 19th century. Like with post-Fordism, neoliberalism, all these prefixes post and neo indicate a quandary that there is something different, but there's still something ongoing. I wouldn't say of course, it's totally true.
You have still imperialism, you have still colonialism, you have still the old school liberalism, but it's also true that we can't do as if nothing happened, if there's not the rise of China, as if China is still a colony of, the Brits, as if China is not also colonizing or doing imperialist politics like I don't know, Russia is doing, or maybe in the future also India is doing. So it is still neoliberalism and it's still colonialism, but it's also true that so the actors are different, the technologies are different, the subjectivities are different. It's, I think,
But the agenda is the same.
yeah, but
To be honest.
yeah, but I said, so this is our job to see the similarities, but also how it's still the same but different. So it's still capitalism, it's still all these horrible crises, but so not the same like in the industrial age, not the same as in the high point of class struggle, where in every country there was a strong communist movement, which nowadays doesn't exist. There's not even a social democratic party in most of the countries.
You know, it's a very technocratic thing. What's global south and global north? You have a list that UN publishes every year. It's produced by a Chinese agency that is hired by the UN, and they update the list every year. No country in Europe belongs to the global south, by the way, not even us. There used to be Albania, not even Albania anymore. So nobody from here is in the global south. But physically, for example, Australia is south, but it's not the global south. So it depends on GDP and stuff like that.
Yeah, of course. It's not a geographical. It's like with Western Marxism. Western Marxism doesn't mean they are all coming from the West also.
But if you exclude Australia, it's going to be a little geographical.
It generally, yes, it corresponds with geography, but not necessarily. Brazil is an exception, for example. Mexico is an exception.
Yeah.
They have
And you have,
we have to take a break.
and you have global south also inside industrial countries like in the US, which is in a way it's a failing state. So a lot of totally poor people can't even so go to a doctor or
The central part of the
And you don't think that raising authoritarianism has something to do with Russia?
yeah, we can discuss it in the break now to find a
Yeah. So yeah, we're 25 minutes past our.
Do you have a program here or something? What is coming?
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I have no Wi-Fi here. I need to
give you the password and everything.
turn it off.
And I told him to print it out.
I have
You see, people don't always use apps.
Oh, yeah.
I will
First I
open
have to-
this app here.
First I need the
I
password.
can't convince Rista to print the app. He wants everybody to be.